Thanks for joining us this evening and the work that's been done so far. And we're looking forward to your presentation on the risk assessment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the council. Chief King, as you know, Deputy Chief Teichman joining me here. It's been over a year, since I got here, and one of the first goals that I wanted our administration to accomplish was third-party evaluation, impartial evaluation of the risk that the specific to the community of Laguna Beach. And not only that, but an evaluation of our ability to respond to that risk. And in that is our community risk assessment and standards of cover that was done. We have retained Emergency Services Consulting International, ESCI, to conduct this study for us. And as promised to this body, you are the first ones to be hearing this presentation tonight. We had this planned also to be taken to council. The date is to be determined, but with all of your support and your great minds, this presentation is to you, and it is now made public. So we have spent hours. Chief Teichman was the project lead on this, so she has truly spent hours. Not only giving them all of our data, but spending a lot of time in conversation, talking about the specific risks, how we respond to those risks with our resources here, and what makes Laguna Beach so unique. So they have a really good understanding. So thank you, Chief Teichman, for all that work. And we will hand it over to Richard Curtis, who's joining us tonight, as well as Patrick McIntosh, joining us virtually for the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Curtis, and maybe if I could start, can I share my screen, or Brandon, are we set to go?
Yeah, you should be able to. I elevated you as a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Perfect, thank you. Let me get this set here first before I begin. All righty. So thank you again. It's an honor to be with you folks tonight, and we look forward to presenting this information with you. We've been working on this for some time, and I'll share our timeline schedule with you here in a minute. Maybe I'll just start off with introducing just a brief introduction of myself and the project team for this particular project. I've been with ESCI for a little over 2 years now. I've been serving as a project manager for this particular project and a few others. And I started a fire service career in Oregon back in the 70s. And so I've obviously been in fire service for a few years, running on almost 40 years now. And I finished off in Washington State, retired in 2018. And been working a couple of interim jobs, but then now I've been working with ESCI, like I said, for the last little over 2 years now. Also with us tonight is Patrick McIntosh. Patrick is been with, we started at the same time with the ESCI team. And Patrick has been working as a fire chief in Orange County, as an interim fire chief, and also was a deputy chief for Orange County, California. He worked as fire chief for Huntington Beach and also did an interim stint in Florida. He's been in the fire service for 37 plus years. And then we also have Levon Ugoyan, who isn't with us this evening, but he works in at Camino Island Fire and Rescue up in Washington State. He's an associate consultant with ESCI. And he's got about 22 years in fire service. He's fire chief there, currently still working, and worked with us on this project. And finally, Steve Rivero, who actually started in fire service, but due to an injury after about 18 years of service, ended up transitioning his career to providing GIS and development, deployment and analyst services for fire service. He has his own company and worked with us on this particular project and did some fantastic work. I want to also echo what Chief King had indicated, that Deputy Chief Teichman, in her efforts in moving this project forward and working with us, she's been absolutely superb, and as well as Chief Teichman, the fire department staff that we met with on site visits, and interacted with in terms of getting additional information, and the city staff. So we want to thank all the staff, and they've been perfectly cooperative and helpful in moving this project forward for us. So thank you for that. So tonight we have quite a bit of information we'd like to share with you, and that involves kind of the project, the purpose, findings, recommendations, the risk profiles that you are obviously deeply inherently knowledgeable about, but we're going to cover that from our perspective, and then discuss deployment analysis and go through various different slides with maps and information to share with you, and then an opportunity for you to ask questions. In respect to your time and other business the committee might have tonight, would suggest that maybe we hold off on questions to the end, if that you so desire, so we can kind of present this information quickly, and then we'll get to your questions, and we can always go back on slides and look at them if you have specific questions regarding that, if that's acceptable. So the process, we started this project with a kickoff meeting in October 2022. We scheduled a site visit where myself, Patrick McIntosh, Joe Powers, our managing director, and Levon Ugoyan did a site visit with your city staff. And in December of 2022, we did a presentation, preliminary presentation of the city manager on May 18th, 2023, after we did some work. And then we refined our work, and now we're doing the presentation to the EDPC. And we plan to do a presentation to the City Council January, February 2024, depending on everyone's schedules. So the question is really, what's the purpose of a community risk assessment standard cover? We do a lot of different types of projects. We do fire department evaluations, strategic plans, master plans. This is a specific type of project where we would come in and evaluate the types and degree of community risk that the fire department has with regards to fire protection, emergency medical services, and really an all hazards approach or perspective. We will use national standards as the lens to develop our analysis and information for policymakers to better match the resources for the deployment to that community risk. And those national standards are utilized for the development of the recommendations and given to policymakers to determine the level of service for the community. So the point being is the level of service, you may not agree with our recommendations. You may want to be more restrictive or be more relaxed in the recommendations that we provide for you. That's perfectly your right, and we advocate that you should absolutely do that. Just some general thoughts on findings, just up front. We believe that your community is geographically isolated from other communities, which reduces the benefit of automatic aid that you can retrieve from other adjacent communities. And we'll show you that in some of the mapping later on. Your risk profile is higher compared to other adjacent jurisdictions due to your topographical features. You have some unique characteristics which create more hazards for your community. Your street network and traffic congestion presents challenges to the response times for both fire service getting into a particular area to take care of mitigation of an incident, or for folks to get out or evacuate a particular area. And property is expensive, creating challenges for potential facility expansion or station resiting that we might talk about a little bit later. And predominantly your effective response force, and I'll define that later, is at this point, in our view, insufficient to manage the moderate risk within your community. Brandon, do I need to, you got that covered? Okay, very good. So those are our general findings, and we'll go into more detail about that as we present through here. For one thing that's been released, I'm not sure exactly the date, but you've had it for a bit, is the community risk assessment report. We are trying a new method of providing information for our clients, and that's through electronic means. You're one of the first actually to do this. And so we're curious to hear feedback on whether this is workable for you or is not workable for you. and then that will modify our approach for other clients going forward. But one of the things that we have heard over the years as in ESCI is that the days of a 150, 180 page report doesn't really do anyone really any good. And so we really are trying to find ways to communicate to the public and to you folks so that we can get you the essential information to make good decisions for your community. So what I'm showing you here is a snapshot of the electronic report hub, and the link is listed here, and I'll be sharing this presentation with you. So if you don't have the link and need the link, that can be provided. So to start off with, we'd like to talk a little bit about your community demographics. You have about 23,080 residents in your population. During the daytime, that increases to about 28,000, a little over 28,000. There's about 11,000 or just under 11,000 households and 2,780 businesses in your community. So for those that live in your community that are 65 and better, we'll say, there's a well-known correlation to increased use of the EMS system. And so Laguna Beach 65 and better is 11% above the state average and 13% above Orange County population average. So your call NC demand for EMS calls are ever increasing. And if that community population continues to grow, that you can expect the call load to increase as well. So in terms of your looking at your community risk, one of the predominant things that the fire service provides is fire protection. And so one of the first things we looked at is we did a deep dive in your risk analysis for building risk. And so one of the things that we did is that we obtained data from your city regarding all of your structures, their sizes, the square footage, the building heights. And from that, we calculated the area of each building and determined the fire flow for each building, which is expressed in what we in the fire service call gallons per minute of water. So we have an estimate of how much water is required to extinguish a fire. From that, also presumes a certain number of personnel are required to deliver that amount of water. So we also obtained from the city the information about each building and whether they had a sprinkler system built into that. And if they did, we gave a 50% reduction, which is the standard reduction that's given from the International Fire Code standard booklet. And so from that, we developed a gradient of risk categories based on buildings. And the map you see here is showing about 11,280 structures. 75% of those fall within the moderate risk category. So what we determined is that the building fire flow ranges on the low end for a low risk between 20 to 100 gallons per minute. A moderate risk is 100 to 750 gallons per minute. A high risk is 750 to 2,500 gallons per minute. And an extra high is going to fall in the range of 2,500 to 7,000 gallons per minute. So that's the way that we distributed and commonly distribute our analysis on building risk. One of the other risks that you talked about earlier tonight is your wildfire risk. And what I have in front of you is the high hazard or very high hazard fire hazard zones map. The pink represents the very high fire hazard zone map. And you've had several wildfires near you. In 1993, of course, you had Laguna Beach fire, 16,000 acres. 2022, the Emerald fire caused by power lines down. I heard you speaking of that earlier tonight at 154 acres. And then more recently, also the coastal fire at 200 acres. So you obviously have a big risk within your community regarding wildfire and affecting the residents and the actual built upon structures inside your community. The city of Laguna Beach has about 80% of its land in this zone, and about 65% of the city buildable property is within the very high fire hazard service zone. Also, I might mention this is required by House Bill 38 for defensible space inspections, requiring landowners who want to sell their property to obtain an inspection to ensure that they meet all the requirements before making that on closing. Another one of the risks to your community is earthquake risk. Laguna Beach lies near 2 major inactive faults and 3 dominant active faults. Historically, you've seen earthquake in 1969, 4.3, 92, there was a 6.3 earthquake, in 94, there was the Northridge earthquake. And the map shows that the city of Laguna is predicted to have a low to moderate ground shaking potential from earthquake. So you do have some risk. It's going to fall in the lower category as compared to other communities. But related to that, and I'll talk about in the next slide, is going to be some of the other factors that need to be considered within that. And you have a number of, this map represents the liquefaction soils that are present within your community or run through your community. And so the significant section of downtown commercial and city government facilities are within the liquefaction zone. Some commercial buildings in that zone were built with brick and stone without any steel reinforcement, make them vulnerable to collapse from soft soils. And there's also some prone areas near the Aliso Beach and the Country Club Road across the Pacific Coast Highway. So if you did have a major earthquake or a significant enough earthquake to cause those soils to loosen and to break away roadways, Pacific Coast Highway in particular, you can be isolated from north and south from your city or within your city. Okay. Another risk that you have is a tsunami risk. So NOAA and the California Geological Survey modeled a 9.0 subduction zone earthquake, which would result in significant of a significant tsunami hitting the coast. The tsunami inundation zone is represented by the purple boundary. You'll see that, and I'll see it move my mouse here. It might be kind of hard to see from your screens, but it's across here. And many areas along the beachfront are going to be impacted. A portion of the downtown between Broadview Street and the north of Forest Avenue to the south would be impacted by the tsunami wavefront. And we counted there's approximately 17 buildings, and those occupants of those buildings would be directly impacted by a tsunami inundation wave. Also, the potential tsunami wave could hit across the Pacific Coast Highway near the Aliso Beach Park front here. And I'm trying to move my mouse to show you that. So you do have a significant risk of tsunami in case of a subduction zone earthquake or even a earthquake offshore. Another risk that you're very familiar with is landslide potentials. Of course, you've had landslides in 35, 69, 78, and the most recent in 2005. Which measured 7 acres wide, damaged 19 homes, resulted in evacuation of 300 homes. The city has been put together a task force in 1980 to mitigate this and to monitor, prevent, and mitigate landslides in the future. The map shows the active and historical landslide zones identified and monitored. In addition, you have a fairly big risk in terms of flooding. Again, you've had a pretty good history of that. In 38, 69, and 98, you've had flooding in those particular years. And they've impacted bridges, affecting emergency responders, ingress and egress, and affected some homes and businesses throughout those periods. The City Public Works Department has recently completed a number of construction projects. Those 4 projects are the Coast Highway culvert replacement, the outlet reconstruction, the Beach Street transition realignment, and the Animal Shelter Creek erosion protection. which are all very excellent projects and are predicated to reduce the flood risk by at least 50% or more. The map that you see before you is the FEMA map, flood FEMA map, prior to those projects being completed. That we don't have an updated map after those projects, so we can't really demonstrate to you what the benefits are at this point in time until engineers have go in and look at that a little bit more carefully. So one of the things that ESCI does is we do all risk hazard rating evaluation of every community. Whenever we do this, we use the Center for Public Safety Excellence Fire Service Accreditation Standard for determining that risk. That model is premised on the evaluation of 3 factors: the consequence to the community, the frequency of the events, and what impact that would have on the fire department's resources to be able to respond. The estimates are calculated to provide a relative risk score for the evaluation and judgment of us, our consultants, and for you to evaluate. And the greater the triangle surface area, as demonstrated by this screen, by those 3 factors, represents an increase in the community risk. The 2 profiles that you see here is showing a demonstration of a fire, a structural fire with a moderate risk, and the triangle surface area, and then a high risk on fires and its surface area. So the result of this also is a score that we have in the report that you can evaluate a little bit further. The fire department impact is estimated using the National Fire Protection Association risk categories and recommend numbers of firefighters required to fulfill particular task, what we call task analysis. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. I'll show you an example of that. From that risk profile that we get on all the different types of situations that may be facing your community, we then put together an all hazard risk matrix, which talks about the various event types. And then we measure or show examples of from low risk to extra high risk, what that actually might represent if you had a particular situation. In this example, I wanted to point your attention to the moderate risk, which is the yellow column. And then if you look at fires, that's referencing building fires. You have a building that's a residential or duplex type fire. That's going to be a moderate risk. That's going to require, if you go all the way to the bottom, based on NFPA standards, that would require 17 firefighters / EMS personnel, depending on the task. And you currently, the minimum staffing for Laguna Fire Department is 13 personnel. So in that particular scenario, you have a deficit or a gap of 4 personnel currently on duty as a minimum staffing requirement. So obviously you have on low risk categories, you have sufficient personnel to manage that. You have not enough personnel to manage high risk and not enough personnel to manage extra high risk. We recognize that all communities cannot produce enough resources to mitigate all the risks. Therefore, each community must decide on their own the level of service that they can afford and the subsequent level of risk that they're willing to take. So this information is also derived from our next slide, which this is from National Fire Protection Association 1710 standard. It's showing a building fire matrix of the various tasks that I referenced just a few minutes ago that are required to be done simultaneously in most situations. Sometimes they can be done in order, but simultaneously is preferred. And the number of personnel that are required to fulfill those tasks across here. And then again, it matches up to low risk, moderate risk, high risk, and extreme risk. So every one of the types of disasters or events that you saw in the preceding slide is being matched to a task analysis requirement for personnel to be able to mitigate that particular incident. Okay, what I'd like to move into next, that was your risk profile for your community. What I'd like to move into next is looking at your deployment analysis. And Patrick, I'm just going to ask if you have anything that I missed on the last section you would like to add, or if I need to emphasize anything more.
At this point, no, you're right on the money.
Okay. So one of the things that we put together for you is we evaluated your call volume from 2018 to 2022, and we determined that what we call heat maps, or the density or concentration of calls based on that particular data. So the slide you have before you is a heat map showing the EMS responses only. And you can see that most of the EMS responses are centered along in Station 1 area in particular, and partly Station 2, but along Pacific Coast Highway mostly. The next map I wanted to show you is your fire map, your map of your fire responses. And you can tell that they're quite a bit more dispersed throughout your community, depending on the concentration. Again, most of those are within the Station 1 area, and probably secondly, Station 2 area, but they are more dispersed than your EMS calls. And that's probably largely due to the fact that you have a lot of people coming through town that are recreating in your community, out having dinner, shopping, and so forth. We also take a look at your what we call temporal incident data, which is time of day, day of week, and month of year. What's your busiest time? Sometimes it's incumbent on fire departments to adjust their staffing schedules to take care of peak demands. But by and large, there's nothing unique here. This is pretty common. We see this in the fire service. So what we recognize here is from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. is shown to be the peak time call activity for the city of Laguna. It's about 70% of your total call demand. Saturday and Sunday are slightly busier than the rest of the days, but you are fairly busy throughout every day of the week. And due to peak tourism season, July and August are your most active months. Also, we looked at the geographical analysis of this response zones for each station. Now we'll show you maps of those response zones in more detail in a few minutes here. But Station 1 really takes in 46% of the calls, Station 2, 20%. Station 3 has the least at 8%, Station 4 at 17%, and then you respond outside your jurisdiction with the more or less the closest forces concept at 9% for mutual aid. One of the other things we need to discuss is we evaluate your insurance service office rating. We recognize that that the ISO is a component to evaluate a community for fire protection. And ISO collects and evaluates information from communities throughout the US. And they provide a rating from a grade of 1, meaning the absolute best fire protection that you can achieve, to number 10, meaning that you don't have any fire protection available to the community. The valuation is a grade of the community developed so the insurance companies can use that to establish the annual fire insurance rates for building fire protection. Now, the grade that you have as a community is you have a fairly good grade, ISO class 3. I'll show you kind of some areas to watch out for, and some areas of concern, and maybe some adjustments can be made. And so there are 4 significant areas that are evaluated in ISO. The top half of this box shows that emergency communications, your dispatch center, the fire department, water supply, and community risk reduction, which is your fire prevention code enforcement program. You notice that your fire department received the lowest percentage of points out of the entire grade. And then below that red bar, you'll notice that, oops, my apologies, I just hit the wrong slide. Okay, there we go. Below that red bar, the percentage of total points for each of those particular areas. You got in ladder service and reserve ladder service, you have really low percentage points there. Deployment analysis and company personnel, those are your weakest points in the fire department detail. So one of the things that ISO evaluates is they look at the distance from each of the fire stations, measuring 1.5 miles. And they call it, what they call this is they expect that the first engine from every fire station, they call the first due fire engine, should be able to encompass most of the risk within your community from that fire station. So what I'm showing you here is a 1.5 mile distance from each of the fire stations, and I'm going to zip through each of the 4 fire station zones. You'll notice the boundary here that's yellow and black is the fire station 1 zone that we spoke about earlier. This is your station 2 zone, which encompasses a large portion of that. There is overlap, and that's very common to have overlap, and that's actually a very beneficial thing, because not only do you want the distribution of your community of fire stations and your fire protection and first due, you also want them not too far away and close enough so that you can have what's called, and we'll talk about more detail, the effective response force. So bringing people together in a concentration so you have enough staff to do the simultaneous tasks that we referred to earlier. This is your station 3 zone here. And you'll notice that the footprint's quite a bit smaller than you'll notice in the other zones. And that's predominantly due to the street network that's there. And then this is your station 4 zone, 1.5 miles first due. ISO also evaluates the entire community risk to be within a 5-mile travel distance from all fire stations. Otherwise, ISO would give a grade of a class 10 if you're beyond that 5 miles. So for those areas that are beyond 5 miles, you're going to get a class 10, meaning no fire protection, unless there's mutual aid available or some other fire department that can cover that area. As you can see, this 5-mile distance, ISO evaluation of 5-mile distance covers almost all, I believe, all of your community, except maybe at the very northern or eastern tip here, there's a little bit of the community that's not covered. But I do know that your mutual aid resources are definitely going to be covering that area. And I'll show you that in a little bit here as well. ISO also evaluates points for communities with 5 or more buildings, 3 or more stories in height, or they have a fire flow that's greater than 3,500 gallons per minute, or a combination of the two. And the expectation in their evaluation grading scale is that you have a ladder truck company within 2.5 miles of those particular risks. So since the city of Laguna does not deploy a ladder truck, and as a result has received a very low credit in the ISO rating, you'll see the reason why is that the particular map shows the 3 next closest ladder trucks that are mutual aid available to the city of Laguna do not even come close to the city boundary. So we did it. ESCI also did evaluate the standard against closest ladder trucks using NFPA 1710 standard. And I'll show you that map in a minute. But first, I need to explain to you, and I'm sorry, this is probably getting a little bit deep in the details, but I need to explain to you performance measures that are used in NFPA 1710. This particular graphic represents the different aspects of performance measures that we look at for your community. Call processing is the time that the person calls 911 until the unit is dispatched at the dispatch center. Turnout time is the time that it takes for the firefighters to receive the notification of dispatch to start rolling out the door. That's the turnout time. And travel time is the time based on fire station locations and resources availability is the time it takes to travel from the fire station to the emergency scene. So let's starting off with call processing. NFPA 1710 has a standard of 1 minute and 20 seconds for dispatchers to be able to do that. And that's at a measure of 90 percentile, meaning that 90% of all the calls are done within that time frame. Your turnout time, the fire service has two standards. One is if it's an EMS call, you can get out the door more quickly, so it's 1 minute. If it's a fire incident, it takes 1 minute, 20 seconds. So there's two different measures there. And then in travel time, there's actually three different measures. The first one is the first unit to get to the scene should be there within 4 minutes. The second unit to get to the scene should be there within 6 minutes. And then what we call the ERF, or effective response force, which means the full deployment of all the personnel that are required to do all the simultaneous tasks that we talked about before, should get there within 8 minutes. So with that being said, and I don't want to go too deep in this, but if you look at the gray bar, this measure called response time measures from the time that the dispatcher notifies the fire department until and I'm going to use only one of these measures, the ERF, the effective response force for a fire. The EMS call would be 5 minutes, but for a fire, it'd be 9 minutes and 20 seconds based on the standards above in the blue bar. And then a total response time you can see in the red bar, which includes from when someone calls 911 until the unit actually arrives. Those are all measured at 90 percentile measurements moving forward. So the reason I had to share that with you first is because I wanted to now share with you going back to the ladder truck. So even though you saw on the previous map that the boundaries for the 2.5 mile distance doesn't even come close to the city boundary, ESCI wanted to evaluate this from the perspective of, well, could the ladder truck get there in time for the effective response force standard? And we did this with an 8-minute travel distance. So it's starting off with 1 minute increments on the color gradient, starting from dark green to orange, which is the 8-minute boundary. And yes, the ladder truck does get to the city in portions of your community from 2 particular stations, but they don't get very far at all in your community, and particularly doesn't get far into where your community risk is, which is mostly in your downtown area and then along Pacific Coast Highway Station 2 and 4. So the answer, this is one of the reasons why you don't get a very good credit in terms of your effective response force, or in terms of your ISO rating as well. All right. One of the other things I wanted to show you are NFPA 1710 doesn't use mile distance for measurements. What they prefer to use is GIS analysis of travel time. So it actually takes into consideration the street network, the speed limits for each of those streets, how many left and right-hand turns there are, because every time you slow down to make a turn, that affects response time, and any other impediments that might occur. What's not in this analysis, and I know it's a factor for the city of Laguna, is you have a lot of traffic, and that definitely slows down your response times quite a bit. We were not able to get the highway traffic safety data to be able to evaluate that. If we were able to get that, we could do a little further analysis on that. So the GIS here shows that a 4-minute travel time covers about 32% of the area and 53% of the streets in the Station 1 response zone. That's what that green area demonstrates here. The Station 2 response area is getting about 74% of the area, 80% of the streets. Station 3 response area is getting 35% of the area, 49% of the streets. And the Station 4 travel time covers 78% and 91% of the streets in the Station 4 area. So you got really good coverage there. So that gives you a sense of, you actually do have pretty good coverage with your station locations based on the response zones and the city boundaries from our perspective. We will discuss some other modeling that we'll do a little bit later that looks at different alternatives for fire station locations to maximize that coverage a little bit better, but that will be a discussion for later. So next, what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn over to Patrick to discuss the utilization of mutual aid to the city of Laguna and what's available. And so I'll move to the next slide. And Patrick, if you can kind of talk through this.
Sure. I'm going to talk about two things real quick. One is mutual aid and one is automatic aid. So first, let's talk about mutual aid. The state of California actually has a robust master mutual aid system, and actually California is the model and has been for many years for the rest of the country in how to share resources. And as Richard mentioned earlier, no community can staff up for the highest risk, the major incidents on a daily basis. So neighbors have to help neighbors. And that's what the master mutual aid system in the state is for. It allows a jurisdiction, let's say Laguna Beach, and let's take a major brush fire, to ask for help from its neighbors. And the system is in place that they would make that request to a coordinator in Orange County. They would provide resources. If additional resources are needed, it goes to the region throughout Southern California and up through all the way to Northern California. And I think three good examples would be the Coastal Fire and the Emerald Fire last year. Both of those would have utilized mutual aid resources. I know that the Coastal Fire had fire engines coming from LA County as a good example. And going all the way back to 1993, the Laguna Fire had fire engines coming all the way from the Bay Area. In fact, I remember seeing fire engines from the city of San Francisco in Orange County. Wow. So that master mutual aid system is very robust and allows a community like Laguna Beach to ask for help when they have major incidents. So that's master mutual aid. The fire chiefs in Orange County decades ago got together and signed agreements across all of Orange County to send the closest fire station, fire engine, irrespective of jurisdictional boundaries. We call that automatic aid. The computer systems in the various dispatch centers are all connected. We know what fire stations are closest based on GIS and AVL, automatic vehicle locating systems. And so it's we call it seamless, that whatever the call is in the jurisdiction, the closest unit goes. So this map you're looking at, we really have, as you know, three ways to get help into Laguna Beach. This is looking north on Pacific Coast Highway. And as Richard mentioned, if we're talking a structure fire in a residential occupancy, that's a moderate risk. Majority of the buildings in Laguna are moderate risk, so it's a good vantage point to look from. We already know that on a daily basis, the city doesn't have the number of firefighters on duty that is recommended by the national standards to do everything that needs to be done to effectively and safely manage that incident. So when we started this project, of course, it was made clear to us the city has help from all around. Doesn't that mean we're in fine shape? Not necessarily. And it's based on geographics. So this particular map shows if we need to get units to the city and on scene within 8 minutes, that effective response force, that's as far as units coming from the north down PCH can get. So units from Newport Beach barely get past Emerald Bay in 8 minutes. So from the north, not much help in the time frame we need to keep those incidents small and resolve the emergency. So that's from the north. So then if we look I'll call it from the east, you can see the gray border is the city limits there on the left side of the photo. And we get some help from a variety of OCFA fire stations. So if you look kind of to the top of the picture by the El Toro Freeway Y, that's County Fire Station 51. If you look off to the right a little bit in Laguna Woods, that's Fire Station 22. If you look down near the bottom of the page, Aliso Viejo, that's Fire Station 57. There's another fire station just off the picture to the right, that's Station 39 in Laguna Niguel. The Aliso Viejo station and Laguna Niguel station are adjacent to the toll road. So from a GIS modeling, they're able to get pretty far to Laguna Canyon, Station 22 does. But I think the important thing here is, of all the stations around the city edge on the east side there, they can't get into the critical parts of the city in 8 minutes. In fact, as you can see in that map, they don't even come close to getting to Big Bend, which is still a ways from downtown. So not a lot of help from the east in the timeframes we want. And then if we look from the south, a little bit better scenario here. So you can see that's Laguna Fire Station 4 there, above 3 Arch Bay. The fire station that I'll call southeast of that, near Monarch Beach Golf Links, is Orange County Fire Station 30. And then you can see a fire station up the top near El Niguel Country Club, that's Fire Station 5. So, and then Station 49, where one of the ladder truck comes from, is just about 3 o'clock on the photo there off of Golden Lantern. So between those 3 stations, and particularly Station 30, they do provide some solid support to the very south end of the city. So that's the best help that's coming. And again, gets to the south end of the city, but very little help coming from all the way around to the critical, and I'll call it the heat map parts of the city. So, you know, there's some thought that with all the help around us, doesn't that do what we need? The answer is it helps, but not within the time frames we want. For a major incident, a big brush fire that's going to go 2 or 3 days, absolutely. But on a day in and day out basis, even with automatic aid and the computers talking to each other, the stations around the city to the north, east, and south don't provide as much help in the time that we would hope they might be able to. So with that, Richard?
Okay. And one thing I might add to that, thanks, Patrick, is that that analysis is presuming that every unit is in its fire station, not tied up on another call. So once you got one unit out on a call, the next closest unit, which probably is going to be further away, is going to be responding. So that leads me into this, in looking at this particular scenario with, we looked at Laguna Beach Fire Department only, and what particular areas in which we can get the maximum number of stations or 13 personnel to a particular area. In this map, you'll see that the dark green area between Station 1 and Station 2 is the only area where you can get 4 fire stations to your city. And that right now presumes that you're able to get 13 personnel, which is shy of the recommended standard of 17. So you'll also see in the lighter green, that's 3 stations, and then the yellows and the reds are 2 and 1. So then we combine that with looking at all the mutual aid around the city of Laguna, as well as the city of Laguna. And again, this analysis is based on everyone being in quarters and available. And you can see that you have a tremendous amount of support in being able to get a number of stations in your eastern end of the city, down just short of the Big Bend area. You can get up to 7 to 10 stations responding if you dispatched all of them, which I don't believe the response cards or run cards are designed that way to dispatch every station. But what I also want to point out is on the south end, you'll see a slight bit of green. That's 5 stations. That's coming from, that's utilizing all this the City of Laguna stations and Dana Point. So you're able to get 5 stations in that little small zone. But you'll see that again, between station 1 and 2, and particularly station 1 area where most of your building risk is, that you're only getting 3 and 4 stations within that central area. So it's important to note that to reinforce what Patrick is saying is that your mutual aid is valuable and definitely need to use it, but you're not going to get there in the time frames you need to mitigate something quickly to prevent it from spreading quickly. Okay. So what I'd like to do is talk about, we were asked to take a look at the particular current station deployment modeling and what that looks like in terms of coverage for your city, and then look at other station locations. So the city has they had a report put out indicating there are some significant challenges and safety upgrades that are needed for all of the facilities, but in particular, some more than others. And so we were asked to take and analyze different station locations and combining stations, and I'd like to run through that now. So the GIS was programmed to evaluate the current coverage of the 4 fire stations staffed by the City of Laguna. And so the one exception to this is that in this particular mapping analysis, and also the previous maps that you've seen regarding Station 4, we utilize the new station location property that's already been purchased. There's only a slight marginal difference in using the current station location versus the new station location. So we thought, just for consistency wise, we would use the new station location property for this analysis. In this particular situation, the results showed that 79% of the historical incidents would be captured within 4-minute travel time from all the fire stations with the current station configuration. We were then asked to take a look at a 3-station analysis. And the reason we were asked to do that is the question that was, could we combine the staffing at Station 1 and Station 2 into one new facility? And what would that do to our deployment? And then evaluate that. So what I'd like to say is the GIS then evaluates on its own through calculations in meeting response time standards with the street network, the ideal location. And that's what that dot here in the middle between Station 1 and 2 represents, is a selected location by GIS as to where that fire station would be located with the combined staff from Station 1 and Station 2. What we found in that analysis is your current coverage is 79%, and it would reduce slightly down to 74% to combine those two. We then said to the GIS, asked it to just select 4 locations, all new, irregardless of current station locations, to maximize the coverage to all the incident data. And this can improve your response by as high as 87%. But that assumes that you're going to replace all 4 fire stations in new locations and buy property. We know that's not realistic, but we wanted to show you the analysis anyway, just so you have an idea of where the GIS would place those particular fire stations. So in this particular scenario, you're going from 79% coverage to 87% coverage. And then we did a 5-station analysis to take a look at that. You would go from 79% to 93% coverage of all the incidents in your particular area. So those are the station deployment modeling. I know when we get to questions, we're probably going to end up back here or to some other slides. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to cover 3 more slides and then open up for questions. The next 3 slides are discussing our recommendations for the City of Laguna. So one of the areas that we want to talk about is emergency service deployment. We believe that it would be in the city's best interest to improve its staffing levels over the next 5 years to meet NFPA recommended effective response force standards. So we suggest, because of process and budgetary constraints and opportunities to make proposals to get that through the budget process, it would probably take 1 to 2 years to improve the daily minimum staffing to 15 personnel. Currently you're 13, adding 2 personnel per shift. That's a total of 6 additional firefighters. And then another 3 to 5 years, add another 2 additional personnel per shift. Now, there's 2 approaches that we suggest you could look at. One is completely adding new full-time equivalents to the department to increase that staffing. Or the other approach would be to upgrade your existing ambulance operator positions to be trained as firefighters and to cross-staff both of those and then fill in your ambulance personnel. That's the predominant recommendation we have. Is we believe that it would be incumbent for your community to be able to provide the minimum level of service to manage moderate risk incidents and low risk incidents, and that there's no expectation that you're going to be able to manage without the mutual aid coming to you the high and extra high hazards that you have with the community. One of the other recommendations we have is for you to modify the policy requiring 2 paramedics to accompany all ALS patients to the hospital to be modified to require 2 paramedics to only critical level patients. We believe there's quite a bit of time that the second unit is out of service and not available for other calls, which could increase response times from other stations. And so we recommend that that policy be changed. We also would like you to consider replacing one of your type 1 engines with a telesquirt, which is a lightweight ladder. It's not going to give you 100% credit on your ladder rating for ISO, but it will give you some credit. And with that, you might be able to improve your class rating from a 3 to a 2, possibly. We don't know for sure, but we definitely know it would increase your points that you would get for that rating. We think that implementing your traffic signal preemption citywide would be a real benefit to improving your response times. In terms of community risk reduction, improve the public education programs to increase community awareness regarding all the city's significant risks that they have. Increase participation in the Greater Laguna Coast Fire Safety Council, and there's a number of recommendations that we have within our report that goes a little bit more detail. Expand the city's fuel management program, and then also have an external review of the program's effectiveness in achieving a safer community. So in terms of expanding the city's fuel management program, we know that there are a number of areas that can be added to once there's the revenue sources to be able to do that, to be able to reduce the fuels in your community. And then biannually review the city's mass evacuation procedures and conduct training exercises, formally adopt the red flag restricted parking program and expand it to other areas. That's going to help increase the ability for folks to get out of the area if they need to evacuate, and for the fire department to get into areas if they need to respond. And then complete the recommendations contained in the 2019 wildfire mitigation fire safety report. We know that you've gone a long ways to get a lot of that accomplished, but we notice that there are still some things to work on. And then finally, personnel and staffing and facilities. We recommend consider supporting full sponsorship of paramedic training programs so that you are moving your people up from firefighter EMT positions within your organization, providing them opportunities to expand and grow and move into paramedic positions as needed. Consider transitioning your nurse educator to a full-time position. You have a lot of medical responsibilities in terms of providing paramedic level service and transport services. So the nurse educator is going to be able to support that entire program. Transition the administrative captain to manage the department's training and safety programs. At this point, as far as I'm aware, and Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, there's really all the training and safety programs are managed at the shift level by battalion chiefs, which is very difficult to do when you're working shifts and you're managing all the day-to-day operations. So having that cohesion of a single person being able to manage the training program across 3 shifts is really important for an organization. Consider adding a full-time 40-hour public educator to manage the community risk reduction programs, kind of supporting the previous slide. And then under facilities, develop a facility improvement plan, replacement plan, including financing to bring all the fire stations up to modern seismic and operational standards, and evaluate essential communications infrastructure for resistance to wildfire and natural disasters. So that's not all the recommendations. That's not all the detail. That's a summary of some of the key recommendations that we have for you, but the total list is in the report through the hub. So at this point, it took us an hour to run through that, a little longer than I was hoping to. So I apologize for taking so long there, and I would open up for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much. That was a very thorough presentation. It's a lot of information, a lot to digest. So really appreciate the comprehensive information. Chief King, do you have anything you want to add before we go into some questions?
I don't actually. Let's go ahead and jump into the
Okay.
conversation.
I'll pass it over to my colleagues shortly. I just have a couple. I think I understand the effective response time concept. I might need a little bit of clarification. It's essential, and please correct me here. It's essentially not necessarily response time, because that would presume it would be the first response that gets there, but when you have enough resources at an incident, is that accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And thank you for clarifying that. Actually, there is a response time standard to the effective response force. And so if you visualize this in 2 different ways, one is you want the resources distributed within your community so that you get a unit there first on scene to start initiating some of the work that's necessary. So if you have a medical incident, you can start CPR, you can start breathing for the patient, you can give Narcan, all those sorts of things you want to do immediately. But then you're going to need additional personnel to help support that particular type of incident. And that's where you need the concentration. So you need other resources to come in within the proper time frame to be able to help out. You don't want to wait 20 minutes for the next unit to arrive or the effective response force. You need it there within the 8-minute standard according to NFPA, or a standard that you develop on your own. So it can be a little bit longer, but it's a standard that you would develop.
I'm sorry to interrupt. And does NFPA place more weight or emphasis on one measure or the other, whether they, maybe for insurance purposes, is it first unit arrival or the effective amount of personnel?
No, it does not. It does not place more emphasis on one or the other. They're really companion and need to support each other. So you really need to think about a continuum of care or a continuum of operations, and you need from the start some initial actions to be taken, but then supported with all the additional personnel to do the simultaneous tasks.
Okay, and then I have a question on the upgrading of the ambulance operators to become fire personnel. One of the factors that was cited as as important when the decision was made to go in-house was these personnel are essentially going to be, they're going to be gone, and they're going to be held up at the hospital for periods of time. And so would that be still a benefit as you see it, or is this do we have to sort of factor that in, that if they're transporting a patient to a facility, they will be out of pocket for some period of time?
There's going to be some benefit with them being available when they are in quarters. And Patrick, please chime in if you have something you want to add to that. But we would say that adding the full-time equivalents would be your preferred option, but then we understand the revenue sources and the cost of additional personnel. and the expense to a community. So this would be maybe an intermediate sort of step that you could take until you could afford to bring in the full-time equivalents.
And
Patrick?
and based on call volumes, that you don't have that many incidents where both ambulances are busy. So if you had upgraded both ambulances to firefighter medics, chances are good you're going to have at least 15 people available, which is almost exactly what you need. And on a lot of calls, because it's not a large call volume in the city, having all 17. But Richard's right. It comes down to funding and what's available. Obviously, there's already a cost for the ambulance staff now. And so upgrading those positions to firefighter medics, there's a little bit of cost savings. But Richard's right, in an ideal world, would we do the full-time equivalents and also maintain the ambulance operators? That's a good model. In fact, all of the paramedics on the engines and the ambulance operators being the EMTs, not firefighters, is the model that I worked with 6 years in Huntington Beach that worked extremely well. So, it all gets down to policy decisions and financial considerations. So that's why we laid out two different options.
Okay, and last question from me is the admin, I think you used the word transition, the admin captain position to oversee all training. I'm presuming that would be an additional FTE position?
You haven't had.
I would, is this?
I could take that one. It's not. We have one captain assigned to administrative assignment right now. His current responsibilities, he helps with logistics, oversight of the day-to-day needs of the stations when things break down. He facilitates those repairs, also with our apparatus, keeping them in service, ordering equipment, and he works as our public information officer whenever we have an incident, coordinating communications with the city, and he is becoming a certified safety officer so that he can show up to any working incident and have the safety oversight on scene. So it would be a transition responsibility, but the position exists.
Okay, thank you. Open it up to others.
Yeah, I've got a question. I guess in the deployment slide that you showed, it seemed like east of the city or the Laguna Canyon Road, it seems like we're kind of short in that area. And the only way we would get coverage was to go through a 5-station scenario, it looks like. And of course, that's something that's, very difficult to do. In the recommendations that you have, are these going to make any kind of an impact as to the coverage for that area?
So I would say, if I could just make a correction, if I misspoke earlier, the 5-station deployment does provide you better coverage for your city, but we're not recommending that you do that because you actually have really good mutual aid coverage on the east end of your city. So if you remember Patrick's section, he showed you some maps with the red boundaries coming down in from the east side. That area is covered fairly well. I don't believe there's a benefit for the city, the community, to add a 5th station. But Patrick, if you want to chime in, please.
Yeah, I think one of the keys there is obviously a 5th station is a huge fiscal consideration if you were going to do that. You do have automatic aid that comes into the tip of that east end, but part of the reason we wouldn't make that recommendation is based on call volume, and I'll call it the heat maps that Richard showed you earlier of where the incidents are. Although there's a good portion of that canyon area that don't have good coverage, quite frankly, there's not a lot of calls up there. And if you were to look back at that heat map, the one spot that had a little bit of calls was the alternative at the location of alternative housing that the city's currently providing to some folks. So the call volume really isn't there. And with adjacency of some of the mutual aid resources or automatic aid, although they don't get far down the canyon. We wouldn't recommend adding a fifth station.
Right.
If there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, certainly. But we don't believe that's the situation either.
Richard Sonny Myers, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You kind of cleared my question up when Dr. Musali asked us about the fifth station, so I had a question about that. But further in that, where on the map is the fifth station? I can't determine what road, what block of land. Where would you propose that fifth station be if we did have a pot of gold?
Oh, I would have to find out for you, to be honest with you. This particular
Okay.
map doesn't provide the detail necessary to determine where that's
Yeah,
at.
it looks like it's in the middle of our park.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
Canyon.
yeah,
Yeah, this is more or less a representative map of where the approximate location would be. So,
Okay. Yeah, I was
yeah.
just curious about that. And then maybe I misunderstood. Did you say the travel times and the data does not account for traffic?
That's correct. It does not account for traffic. We were unable to get the state's data regarding congestion.
Well, wouldn't that be good to have?
Yeah, absolutely. It would be
traffic
good to
study.
have.
Okay, I just think it would
On
be
that-
nice to
on
know
that
how
note,
much time it would
in
take to
your-
get there.
In the
summer.
document, there was also there was no dispatch time available. It's sort of a blank spot in there. Do we know what the reason for that was?
We have given the fire department staff in the city the dashboard that has the information regarding dispatch processing time, turnout time, and response time based on the historical data. I will say there are some anomalies with the data, but that is available. Yes.
It's just not in the report.
It's not in the report. Yes.
Okay. And then and since you mentioned turnout time, is there a in relation to the NFPA standard, it seems the turnout time was remarkably higher. Is there any?
Yeah, again, I think there are some data issues that need to be worked through, but what we did find in the data that was given to us, and we did it twice, was that your turnout time is longer than what national standards require. Now, let me just say that we find that actually quite often in a lot of the studies that we do. The turnout time is high. And so there are a number of different reasons why data can be skewed one way or another. And what I had suggested to the chief and deputy chief is that there be further investigation in the dispatch processing time, dispatch and the turnout time, and the data collection, so that you can refine that and figure out where, if any, gaps exist and what to do to fix that. Patrick?
yeah, Richard, another thing that plays into those get out times is fire station layout. And there are, pretty much all of your stations over the decades have gone through renovations, changes, and it's not the easiest flow
Right.
that you would see in a modern fire station that's designed to get people from the living portion to the apparatus and out the door. So some of, besides some anomalies in the data and looking at other ways to improve all of that, some of it is the physical characteristics of some of the stations in the city based on their age and how they were laid out and changed over the decades.
On your recommendations, I noticed that one of them was to increase the involvement of the Greater Laguna Coast Fire Safe Council. Since I'm the chair of that council, I have not heard from you, and I'm curious what you were thinking and what sort of increased involvement you were recommending or whatever. It's not a very active fire safe council. I mean, we've been around for a long time. I think we're the third one in the state out of 200. But I was just kind of stunned that I was suddenly going to be increasing activity and what on earth you're talking about.
Patrick,
So,
you want to address that?
Yeah, I'll take that because we had some conversations early on. When we initially started the projects and actually had this conversation of how long your fire safe council had been around and how much participation you specifically don't have.
Right.
And so, right. And so from that perspective and knowing the risks in the community,
Oh, I remember that
think-
conversation.
I think
yeah.
you as the chair, based on those conversations, could use more community involvement, more community interest, and more community commitment to what the Fire Safe Council's mission is. Is it possible to achieve? Don't know. Can we maybe increase education? Can we maybe look at neighborhood specific participation? Maybe, but I think that recommendation was an acknowledgement that the degree of participation that you have as the chair from the rest of the community isn't where we think it could be or would help better serve the community.
Okay, fair enough. That's the situation.
Okay.
That's an accurate assessment.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the great presentation and Chrissy for everything as well that you did on this project so far. I think the evacuation study has traffic information. It's 435 pages if you guys want to page through that. So you might have some information on traffic from that particular study in terms of use of existing infrastructure and kind of what we can use and utilize. But otherwise, great report, and I'm sure it'll have a lot of practical application as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Tim Templeton. Thanks again for presenting to us. What I wanted to touch on really quickly is the landslides. You said this is just a summary, and so I don't know if you do have other recommendations as far as mitigating landslides, but for my anecdotal information, I get a letter every few months or maybe every 6 months or so from the city telling me that I have to clear the drain behind my house because the property records indicate that I own the drain, and I do not own the drain. It's not my drain. It's the property behind me. Maybe 2 years ago, somebody came out and poked around and left. But I think that it might be a good idea for the city to inspect the drains and make sure the property records are correct, that they know who's responsible for them. In my case, the drain behind me, one property over, the neighbor built over it and has her backyard over the top of the drain and has a white Pyrex pipe coming out. And I asked her about it, and she said, "Oh, I got permission from the city to do this." So we've been discussing this in the committee in the past, that one of the ways to mitigate the landslides is to make sure that the drainage is kept clear. And I'm just wondering, was that one of your recommendations that didn't make the summary page, or maybe it's something that you guys might want to dig deeper into?
That really wasn't a recommendation that we provide any further detail on. I think that's a little bit beyond the scope of our expertise, honestly, where we're talking about development requirements and soils engineers and certain ways to mitigate projects as they're being developed. When we did the site visit, we did notice, it was surprising to us, the current development, housing development behind City Hall that was being erected, and we just as a layperson was like fairly surprised that was occurring. But you know, that's a decision that I think is a little bit beyond our scope. So we did not, to answer your question directly, we did not offer any other suggestions regarding the mitigation of landslides.
Well, Chief, Matt Lawson here. I think you guys have both done a great job on this. I am very impressed with what we've seen. This is kind of the outgrowth of a recommendation that came out of our committee. We called it a staffing adequacy study because we didn't know any better. Chief Nickham wasn't with us at that time. This goes back to, I want to say, May of 2021. I think there is real, I mean, there are little nitpicky kinds of questions we could ask here. But in my view, the critical question to ask is really of our own fire department command staff leadership, which is what they view as the most critical items to pursue in order. And I guess the bigger question is to ask, having seen the tentative agendas for the better part of the last year showing this coming up at council on the 24th of October, who made the decision to take it off the agenda and push it off into next year? I mean, as I see it, if we're serious about public safety being our top priority in this city, it's very difficult to understand what would be a higher priority than getting this information in front of council. Our fire department is grossly understaffed and under-resourced. I mean, my God, that's kind of important, I think. And I think we really do need to get this in front of council. I see one of our council members in the audience. Perhaps we can get that request made to get this up in front of council on the 24th or as soon as possible thereafter, so we can move this forward. And Chief, is there any reason why you feel you need to do more work on it before this is taken to council?
No more work, but I think what's going to be important when it does go to council is that they have the opportunity to go through the report thoroughly. And I know that it was just delivered electronically to you as a board last Wednesday, but now it is also made public and made available to council. I'm making myself, Chief Teichmann's making herself available to every single council member. That's one of the reasons. We just want to make sure that they have the opportunity to dig into it, to ask us those questions. So it's not done over the course of, a 5-hour council meeting. But we want them to have thorough understanding. So as of last week, I've made myself available, as did Chief Teichmann, so that we can start meeting with those council members in those one-off meetings. And we do fully intend to get it. Believe it or not, here we are in October and we're looking at the schedules. We're going to be in the holidays coming up. There's not a whole lot of council meetings. Our intent is to get it as quickly as possible, but also make sure each council member has the opportunity to meet with us individually at their request.
And Chief, if I might add it in support of that a little bit, part of it is on our side, only having 2 city council meetings in the month, and on the 24th, all of our team is not available to be there. And so that was a big part of the 24th. Richard, I correct on that, right?
Yeah. And November 7th, yes.
Yeah, so part of it was our availability to get our team into town to be there in person didn't work. And then obviously the holidays. We want to, do our best to meet your needs, to meet the fire chief's needs and the council needs, and trying to get those calendars synced up on city council days. The 24th wasn't going to happen on our side. We couldn't have the people there to do this presentation and to be able to do it right and to answer the questions for the council and to represent it appropriately.
Well, that's certainly understandable. Chief, what are the top priorities that you see? In other words, if you were sitting in front of council instead of in front of us, and we asked you, what do you need funded now? What are the 1 or 2 or 3 projects? I mean, the one that cries out to me is getting enough firefighters to actually fight a fire. The other one is doing something about the fact that our 800 megahertz communication system is dependent on one 30-foot antenna that has no visible means of structural support. But I mean, there may be others that are higher priority, or I don't know.
So I look at this report, first of all, as it's very valid. It's objective. It comes from a third party, obviously, so it's not just coming from the fire chief and my own observations, which gives it great value. I think the most important thing is that we do present to council. They understand the report. Our fire department is great. And I think you guys all agree with that. They're professionals. They've learned to adapt, to respond to this community. They train and cross-train as to what truck companies do. So they've closed the gap. They have special tools and they know how to respond to this community. They do it very well.
But without sufficient resources and without sufficient facilities, and without sufficient
You're
manpower.
absolutely right. Yeah.
And
Which,
I've sat on this committee since its inception, and we've been saying the same things and saying the same things for more than a decade.
and I think what this report is going to do is going to allow me as the fire chief to put it down in writing, to have a conversation with council, with the community, and I can give my opinions, but I think we do a really good job of carrying out the mission day to day. Can we do better? I think it was just pointed out how we can do better. But next is putting it in a strategic plan and making those financial decisions responsibly and over the course of time. It's going to take time, right? We've been talking about Fire Station 4 many years before I got here, and it's still in the works and it's still a couple of years ahead of us. And that's just one fire station. We have to look holistically at how responsibly do we get to raise the bar a little bit with our staffing levels. But when we do that, it's a big investment by the city. I think we have to look and have conversations with the association and how we use those members most effectively. The recommendation to transition our ambulance program is in there. That's another large conversation. It's a great workforce that we have. They're young, they're eager, and it's a program that has added benefit. That benefit, obviously, we'd have to have those conversations of that benefit going away. Those people just entering the job market, but they're willing to come in and provide a great service and be a part of our department at a lower pay rate. And they're only here for a commitment of 3 years before they use that as a stepping stone into a profession. So there's advantages. All these things need to be discussed. The other portion of it is, and it's a big portion of it, and I don't want to underestimate the value of adding the public education and the awareness, the Fire Safe Council. That is such a huge critical piece of adding a position to Brenda Manning and having a force multiplier for what the community needs to do to prepare. That is a really big piece. And those are just a few positions I think that might have the greatest impact, while all these other conversations are the bigger cost items and the growth is put down and evaluated.
Well, back in January of 23, about 6 months before you got here, there was an analysis published, which I'm sure you've seen, by staff that basically said we could have our AMBO staffed by cross-trained, fully qualified firefighter paramedics instead of the AMBO operators. The incremental cost would be about $1.3 million. I think that was the number that was bandied around, suggested at that time from that analysis, which by my calc would be literally a transition, a shift, if you will, of 1 percentage point of the city's overall annual spend. I mean, is that something that you could implement operationally sooner rather than later? Or is that something that would take a long time to transition in for various operational issues that maybe I'm not aware of?
I think, again, it's something that needs to be evaluated by all of you, by council, by the community, because there's pros and cons to it. You can put a dollar figure on it, but you have to understand what we talked about is a little bit of the reliability of those ambulances. How often are they even in the community and available versus how long they're at the hospital? So you have to look at the true value of that, and we have to look at that objectively. And then you enter into the conversations with the association, because it truly is changing the current responsibilities of a firefighter on this department. We wouldn't hire firefighters and then put them on the ambulance 100% of the time because degradation of skill. They need the practice of being a firefighter. They need the frequency of being. So you'd have to be able to rotate them. Right now, we don't have a rotation. So it truly is changing the entire profession of our current existing workforce. So those are conversations that would have to be had with the association and their current job specifications.
Great.
Well, let's get you the money first and we'll figure it out.
Chief Nickum, thank you.
Patrick Richard, thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to recognize the time, experience, knowledge, and full commitment to the fire service that you've both provided. I feel the study is comprehensive and it'll prove to be of value as we push towards a better prepared community. Your recommendations, from my perspective, are on target. Aside from the key points, notables were the strengthening of the workforce. And we're looking at upgrading the AOs to firefighter paramedics, the career leadership proposals sponsored, ICS qualifications and getting our certifications tightened up a little bit. I love the idea and support the 40-hour educator. This is someone that can take the place of several of Chief King's staff and allow them to focus on what their real responsibilities are. As far as coordinating community outreach, managing all social media, hosting fire department events, recruitment of fire safe council, David.
Yes.
Right now, that consists of David and Shelley. That is our fire safe council.
And overall, just would prove such essential advantage to our presence in the community. The concerns I have are the capabilities of our communications program and the challenges that are faced with it. Turnout times are particularly concerning. Challenges with dispatch, as well as our challenges with IT. The thing I'm probably most concerned about that I didn't really see talked up much is the hardening of homes. And I think in September, the insurance institution released a study that indicated from their studies that up to 90% of structures lost in the wildland arena could be contributed to imbricast. So that's a significant number and a potential shift of our wildlands defense strategy. I would support if we could focus a little bit more on that. And again, hardening the home is a new term to a lot of people, especially people that aren't involved in the fire service. And again, that's where our nurse educator could push us into a new horizon. Anyways, overall, excellent report. We'll be so looking forward to working with Chief King and staff as we move through these and be as much of a assistant as we can. Thank you very much, men.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again. I appreciate the presentation and a lot of information and very helpful. So on behalf of the committee.
Thank you. And maybe one final comment from me, if I could, and Chief King kind of hit on it. With your current resources in your fire department, you have very dedicated people at all levels, providing amazing services to the city at a professional level. And the report certainly has a lot of recommendations on how do we make things better. But as a starting point, certainly, please don't lose sight of the great organization you have, the great people that you have, and their true commitment and dedication to the city of Laguna Beach and to your residents, because it clearly resonated with us as we made our sites visit and went through fire stations and met with staff. The community's fortunate to have the people they have in the fire department. Our goal is to provide some information and tools to help them do even better. So with that said, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Deputy Chief. Appreciate it.
Well, Chief, I really do have a couple questions really for our own internal people, because I agree. I mean, you might have done a great job, and I think you've given us the information that we need to go back to council. I mean, us collectively to go back to council and basically put this on their dais front and center and say, what are we going to do about it? Because we have tremendous resources here in Laguna Beach. Our problem is not a lack of resources, it's a lack of focus and a lack of will. And we haven't built a fire station in almost 60 years. which is pretty ridiculous when you think about it. Now that's finally changing, but we need to have a program in place to replace these overage fire stations. And we need to have a program in place, comprehensive program in place over the next X years to properly resource our fire agency, which has never been properly resourced from what I can determine. And the people we have, I think, are terrific, but it's a little bit like the Ukrainian military. I mean, they need the tools and the technology, in some cases, some training to really do everything that they are required to do in a very high threat environment.
Julian, we do have 2 members of the public if they want to speak. The
Oh.
guys in the back don't count.
Oh, yeah. And anyone from the public who would like to comment or speak on this topic? Sorry, Tom.
I was on the EDPC for 4 years, as you all know. And one of the frustrating things is a lot of the things that we, and Matt, we were working on when I first joined,
Right,
including this study.
right.
It took, I think the first time you raised it or we started talking about it was like 3 years ago.
Right.
And, and with a prior fire chief. And it's finally come around and it's, my reaction was, it didn't tell me a lot we didn't know, but it comes from an objective source that gives us another, way to inspire and maybe induce council to act.
What's documented the obvious.
Right. And, so my point isn't so much, looking to the fire department, fire personnel, or the chief or the police chief to change hearts and minds on the city council. I think their objective, opinions and comments are critically important. What's going to do it is folks like you and folks getting out in the community, candidly, like me and a lot of others who are passionate about this. I speak to city council members all the time. I speak to Alex all the time. And when I have the opportunity, I push this. But it is the public awareness aspect that kind of runs through everything that's going to make this community safe. Because without that, nothing's going to, or it's going to happen, but at such a slow rate, notwithstanding incredibly good and well-intentioned council people and, senior city management. So, kind of my takeaway is your last point, Matt, how do we do this? One is there's always inertia in government. But second is, I think that the public relations aspect is probably the most fundamental. Think about from a committee, and this is my suggestion to you, is to think about how you can get the word out. So maybe it's important, in addition to having great people come before you and instigating great ideas, is to focus also, and not in lieu of all those important other things, how getting the word out. I mean, you look at the people on this committee. I'm embarrassed that I was on it because I don't meet your guys' level of expertise. I'm just a poor country lawyer. But the quality of the people, here, if they got out speaking or writing, and it's not a lot of time. I write and speak probably more than I should, but the point is that each of you have so much to add to the city and educating the city. And maybe the committee as a whole, one of the things that I kind of work with you guys on is increasing the stature of the committee. With that stature comes influence. So think about that kind of influence. And it's not simply getting this on the agenda, but getting it to happen sooner, than later. So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
I just want to say it was a overwhelming report. It made me, I sort of walked away from that thinking like, what did I just get myself into running for city council? Because I feel like we really need to do something to address so many of the concerns that were raised. To me, I don't know if the issue is having the public support, because I think we could have 0 people from the public come and say something on this, or we could have 30, or we could have 50 people who want to like redesign the fire stations. I don't know if that would make the difference. I think what would be helpful for the councils to have very clear recommendations. If we had $500,000, what would we do with that? If we had $1 million, what would we do with that? How do we get, I mean, ultimately, I think we have to basically build three fire stations over the next 8 years, when we didn't do that over 50 years. So I think, to me, what would be helpful as this comes forward is, what are the specific recommendations, and how, if we assume that we're going to invest in this, because I think we are, then what's the first step? How do we get this moving so that we're not here in 3 years still talking about this? We're hopefully here in 3 years with at least closer to 17 personnel on duty. So that's how I'm looking at this. So any help from the committee or the staff as we move forward, I think that would be very helpful. So really great presentation, overwhelming, but very, very helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Chief, this kind of I agree with Councilmember Renagi 100%. I agree with Tom Gibbs 100% too. But I mean, I think one of the things that we need to do is to come up with really an implementation plan. And we can certainly assist in that as best we can, but we do best when we focus on the what and leave the how and the who to the experts on staff. And look, you guys have tremendous expertise in this area. And assuming you had the resources, how would you implement this? What would we do first? What would we do second? How would you phase it in?
I think some of what they both said is very valid. And I think as we start to have the conversations, even with all of you, our one-off meetings with the council members, they're going to have a deeper understanding. We can have those conversations because we saw a bunch of recommendations. There's a lot there, right? If you put a dollar value on everything that they said, we would be in the planning process and needing to see results over the course of 30 years. It would take time. But I think naturally we're going to see what's important, what can be implemented quickly. That's going to have the biggest impact as far as keeping this community safe. Right. And we were going to use this as a guide for those conversations, a guide of shortcomings, recommendations, prioritizing time and money. And we hope to see that documented in the fire department strategic plan as our next phase moving forward.
When would you anticipate having that done, or do you see presenting this at council first and then using that as the springboard for the strategic plan?
Yeah, it's going to be the conversations with council, the presentation to council, and then it's gonna take some time, I believe. I would hope within the next year we would have, I would say, be more optimistic. Within 6 months, we would have a finalized strategic plan that we can start moving forward with the prioritized projects.
In terms of looking at the financial calendar, as we all know, I mean, you're looking at a mid-year update. There's usually money available then. Mm-hmm. We're talking about getting recommendations into the next budget cycle, which is really March, April, May, which sounds like it's a ways away, but it'll be here before we know it. And, it's just, we've been talking about this stuff for years and years and years, really decades. And I just think that we need to approach this with a great sense of urgency because we're dealing with a threat factor and a threat level that just seems to keep escalating.
And I don't want to, I think to put in perspective, again, I'll fall back to the level of service. There's no known lapse of service. We didn't have any emergency medical aid calls that we didn't respond to today. Right. There was no fire that we'd had this weekend that we couldn't put out. The master mutual aid system is probably, they said, the best in the nation. I would say probably the best in the world. The master mutual aid system in the state of California, you want 300 engines here within the next 24 hours, it could probably happen. And we've seen it happen in different parts of the state. So again, you start looking at, the threat of the wildland, we have sufficient resources. 80% of our calls, medical aids, we have really sufficient resources. If you start looking at the Delta, what we could do a little bit better to add to to this organization to make it more professional, more resilient against some of like the individual home structure fires, for firefighter safety, for community safety, so it doesn't turn into a larger conflagration.
Right.
Those are the types of things that we're talking about in this report. And then I continue to go back to the big piece that's hard to quantify is the public education. And those resources are listed in there as well. It's hard to quantify the value of those, but I think those are probably some of the most critical pieces that I would push to the top.
I'd like to suggest maybe we let our chief and deputy chief go on and kind of move on. We got a lot of agenda to handle here, and we're on our 16th hour. I started at 5 o'clock this morning, so I'd like to get my day rolling along
Yeah,
here.
well, I
I
think we have
think
the
we
right,
get to retire to our own corners and digest this thing.
I agree. So we have the right professionals at the helm, and the committees here leverage us as you see fit. But it sounds like there's a good roadmap ahead. So appreciate
Right.
your time.
Yeah.
Well, you guys have done a phenomenal job on this, as have the consultants, and we really do appreciate all your tremendous efforts, but let us know what we can do to support this council or anywhere else that we have to, because this really needs to happen. It cannot be an endless conversation. I mean, it needs to be an action plan.
Got it.
All right. Thank you.
Chief.
Thank you,
all.
guys.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get back.
Chief Teichman, we can't say enough good things about the work you've obviously been doing with these guys, so congratulations and thank you.
10 minutes? Okay. Okay, we'll take a 5-minute recess.